Well, greetings, everyone. I'm Dr. Jim Paharic, professor of sociology and director of our National Catholic Center for Holocaust Education at Seton Hill University. Welcome back, everyone, to this session of our conference. So we're going to continue with a really exciting group of presenters today, and I'm sure you'll all enjoy this session. The focus is anti-Semitism during the build-up to World War II and in the immediate aftermath as well. So it promises to be an excellent session. We'll have 75 minutes, and when the speakers have concluded their presentations, I hope that the audience will interact with them through the chat feature. So please pose any questions you have, and we will get to them. Just a quick reminder, too, that after this session, we'll take a break, but then we'll reconvene at 7 p.m. with a really distinguished group of panelists, some longtime scholars of the Holocaust and educators who will be talking about their recent work advancing Holocaust studies. So please be sure to join us at 7 p.m. this evening. And now I will turn things over to my colleague at Seton Hill, Dr. Michael Carey of the Political Science program, who will introduce our first speaker.
All right, thank you very much, Jim, and welcome to everybody. I'm very excited. This is a very distinguished panel. We have three very accomplished speakers here today. I'm going to give a brief introduction to who they are, and then a more detailed introduction right before it's their turn. So our first panelist is Beth Griech-Polelle, who's the Kurt Meyer Chair of Holocaust Studies at Pacific University. Our second speaker will be Bradley Hart of California State University at Fresno. We have from the U.S. National Holocaust Memorial Museum, Brown-Fleming. As I said, I'll so let me tell you about Dr. Beth Griech-Polelle. Presentation topic is, the title is The Long History of Anti-Semitism, Myths, Legends, and Tropes About Jews. Dr. Polelle, PhD from Rutgers State University in New Jersey. As I mentioned, she's currently the Kurt Meyer Chair of Pacific Lutheran, which is located in Tacoma, Washington. Prior to teaching there, she was Associate Professor of History at Bowling Green University in Ohio. His publication in this field was entitled Bishop von Galen, National Socialism and Roman Catholicism, published by Yale University Press, 2002. I should mention, if you're interested, this is freely available to the Seton Hill community via our Reeves Library ebook central. Our most recent book is entitled Anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, Language, Rhetoric, and Tradition. And it was published in 2020. And a revised version is being published in 2021. Also edited or co-edited two other books, has authored numerous articles, and served as guest editor for the Journal of Jesuit Studies, a special edition on the Russian Revolution and the Jesuits. And so that is my introduction. So Dr. Griech-Polelle, you're on.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carey, and I'd like to extend my thanks to Jim Paharic and the National Catholic Center for Holocaust Education for inviting me and allowing me to be part of this. I know in the beginning there were some sound issues and a little bit of background noise, so please put into the chat feature if that's happening during my presentation as well. Okay, so we have a certain amount of time, and so I'm going to try to run through, since the our panel is about anti-Semitism before and after World War II. I think you in the audience might be experiencing the same problem that many of my students have the first few weeks of the semester, and that is I don't rush in directly to talk about the Nazis and what Hitler was saying, because I firmly believe that in order for people to truly understand why so many people were open to some of the things that Hitler and other Nazi leaders were saying, we have to go back to where did these stories about Jews originate from? Where did they get their origins? And my hope is that when students understand where some of these myths and stereotypes and tropes about Jews, where they came from, that it will help to dispel some of this mythology that surrounds it. And so what I'd like to do is I'm going to go into PowerPoint. I've got some slides that I'm going to show, and I'm just so here we go. This is the long history of anti-Semitism. And I promise you that our other speakers will go more directly into probably the time period that you would normally think of. But as I said, I want to examine some of these origins and some of these very long-lasting anti-Semitic stereotypes and prejudices. And perhaps the longest myth that we can track as historians is the idea that all Jews throughout all of time should be blamed as Christ killers. And of course, this goes back to New Testament origins, but this becomes one of the most prevalent types of justifications for the debasement of Jews, for their humiliation, for their persecution. And so on this slide, I would draw your attention to the image. And again, it's an ancient, it's actually a medieval image, but we can see from what's left of that image, we can see that there is a depiction of a Jewish man physically beginning to nail Jesus of Nazareth to the cross. And of course, you might be saying, well, how does she know that that's a Jewish man? And the symbolism that we can identify that he is a Jewish man has to do with the hat that he's wearing. And if you look at it, it's a circular hat. It's a little bit kind of ridiculous looking. And in the medieval Christian world, Jews were visibly marked by items of clothing, by badges and so forth. And this was a way of alerting the Christian majority population that a stranger was among them. And so this very harmful idea that all Jews throughout all of time should be held accountable for the killing of Jesus of Nazareth has many long-term implications. Again, primarily as justification for anti-Semitic attacks. In particular,
Beth,
what we're going to find.
Excuse me, Beth. We're not seeing your PowerPoint right now.
Oh, goodness. Okay. Well, I'm glad that you told me that. Okay. So let's.
Yeah. Could you try again to share it with us?
Oh. All right. So let's see. I apologize. Start sharing. My goodness. I was. Told me that. And this is nothing to do with technology. All right. Are you seeing?
No, not yet. Kevin, can you help us out here?
Yeah, Beth, if we just do start sharing, you choose your screen and then you hit the start.
Choose what. Oh, I apologize. All right. And there. How about now?
Oh, now, yes.
Yep, your we can see your PowerPoint.
Okay,
Yep.
well, I would rather that you see everything than nothing at all. So I'm going to just leave that as is, as long as people are not too distracted by, oh my goodness, I don't have 100 slides, so don't worry. Okay, so in this image, what we can see is a Jewish man. We know he's Jewish because of this kind of marker, this hat that Jews were typically forced to wear whenever they were out in public. And this has, again, these kind of long-lasting implications of dividing society into us versus them. There are the Christians, and here I'm specifically talking about the position of Jews in the medieval Western and Central European territories. Okay, so we've got this idea that if all Jews throughout all of time are labeled as responsible for the killing of Christ, of Jesus of Nazareth, there's a lot of spin-offs, or what I'd call corollaries to this. And much of that has to do with the idea that who but the devil would want to kill the Son of God? And therefore, Jews must be working in league with the devil. And this will give us many other kinds of stereotypes that I'll talk about in just a few moments. That's perhaps, as I said, the longest running myths that all Jews throughout all of time should be held accountable for the killing of Jesus of Nazareth. But probably the second most harmful long-standing myth about Jews is that they engage in what's called blood libel, which also sometimes called the ritual murder charge. And here in this particular image, you can see the kind of, it's a woodcut image of a reenactment of what in the medieval mind they believed that Jews were up to. And you can see that specifically it's a Christian child. He's being held and he's basically in the position of the crucifixion. And all of the figures around him are hurting him with sharp objects. They are collecting the child's blood, which will supposedly then be used for ritualistic purposes. And again, I would draw your attention to the imagery in the fact that, again, for some people, they say, well, how do you know that all of those are people that are Jewish? We can see that one man has that circular hat that is a symbol of a Jewish man. But if you look more carefully at all of the people that are in the image, except for the child, they all have a kind of oval-shaped emblem on their clothing, both on the front and the back. And this was something very common in the medieval world. It was called the Jew badge. And it was required whenever Jews went out in public that they displayed this. And again, this was a way of dividing people into different categories. You would know as a Christian coming from behind the person that this is a person who has refused to convert to Christianity. They are not like me, and there's something to be feared. This blood libel or ritual murder charge, the earliest documentation that historians have regarding the first official charge happens in 1144 in Norwich, England, as you can see from the slide. That was basically a case of a little boy went missing. Eventually, his body was discovered in the woods. When the men who find his body begin examining it, they realize that there's these different little marks on his body. And one of the men there says, well, this is the work of the Jews, and I heard they killed children and drained their bodies of blood. And this is kind of the beginning of this origin. But this mythology that Jews are out to kidnap at Christians, particularly Christian children, in many cases it's connected up with Jews as Christ killers, that they want to reenact the crucifixion, and that they use that martyr's blood in some kind of ritual that would be satanic and associated with the devil. All of this kind of coalesces. This charge of blood libel, ritual murder comes up over and over again. And typically this is used as a way to lead to the mass expulsion of Jews, those who are not immediately arrested, and in some cases not even put on trial, but are simply murdered and held accountable for the death of what in most cases might have been an accidental death or someone who genuinely murdered the child, but no real investigation is done. It's just been settled that this is the work of Jews. I would call your attention on the slide also. I put in the last official charge of blood libel against the Jewish community in Europe. And I would specifically call your attention to the year. It is in 1946 in Poland. And of course, this is simply just 1 year after the end of the Second World War. And imagine the horrible irony that Jews who had survived the persecution of the Nazi regime, and many of whom had survived concentration camps, a Christian in this village turns up murdered, and immediately the crowd swings into action and murders many different Jews who had survived the Holocaust. And the charge against them is exactly what I've explained to you, coming from this medieval time period, and it is blood libel ritual murder charge. These charges come up, as I said, repeatedly, and it is thought by at least some historians that if you're asking yourself, how did people come up with this idea that Jews kidnap Christians and then use their blood for ritualistic purposes? Some historians have posited that it has to do with the First Crusade, preached in 1095. There were massacres of Jewish communities, particularly up and down the River Rhine. And in those cases, when the crusading mob began to attack Jewish communities, the Crusaders witnessed that Jews often murdered their own children rather than let them fall into the hands of the Crusaders and be forcibly converted to a religion which they did not believe in. And so some historians have posited that in the medieval mind, if Jews were capable of murdering their own children, then there would be nothing stopping them or preventing them from murdering Christian children and using their blood. It's not a very satisfying explanation, but it's probably the best that I can give you. Now, this blood libel is this image of the expulsions of Jews. And here on the slide, you can see very clearly the community of Jewish men on the right-hand side. And of course, they have the hat that's meant to humiliate them and identify them that they are not Christians. And then to the left of the screen, you can see there's a whole lot of crucifixes. So these are the Christian leaders of society. And in many countries, we find that leaders invite Jews, they grant them permission to reside in a community, and it is usually for a limited period of time. And Jews typically are required to pay a fee for the right to live within that Christian community. However, what often becomes the case is that when these local Christian landowners, all the way up to kings, decide that Jews are no longer useful to them or that they are presenting too great a liability in their territory, they then carry out mass expulsions. Probably one of the most famous expulsions happened in Spain in 1492 when Ferdinand and Isabella not only fund Christopher Columbus's trip to go discover America, but then they also have this push to eliminate Jews from their newly created country of Spain. And so expulsions are typically used over the course of time. And I would stress to people who are new to this topic that if you are Jewish in Christian-dominated, particularly medieval and early modern Europe, you do not have the luxury of deciding exactly where you want to live. And it really does depend on a powerful Christian leader giving the permission that is required and then coming up with the money to pay the fees and the taxes in order to stay in a particular territory. And in that territory, in many cases, Jews are also ghettoized. And this becomes much more common as we get into early modern European history, where there are certain designated streets where Jews are expected to live, and they are locked in at night. And so you do not have freedom of movement. You do not have, as a Jewish person in this time period, the ability to decide when and where you're going to simply, pack up your belongings and move to the next location. And so part of this image of the wandering Jew is rooted in that historical reality that Jews are, in fact, moving about. But that image of the wandering Jew denies the historical reality as to why those Jews are actually moving. They're moving in most cases because they have been forced to uproot themselves. But now connected to this image of the wandering Jew becomes another very predominant prejudice or legend about Jews. And that is that if they are nomadic, if they are wandering, that they're never settled in one particular place for any great length of time. And therefore, they are unable to be truly loyal and at later time period nationalistic in a particular territory. Of course, this is false, right? And there will be Jewish communities that live particularly in places such as Poland from the 1200s forward. But that very dominant image of if you're a wandering people, therefore you can have no nationalistic loyalty is going to be a recurring theme that shows up over and over again in anti-Semitic language. I'm going to move us into slightly more modern times so you can breathe a sigh of relief if you're not as keen on learning about some of these earlier time periods. But I've tried to juxtapose in this slide, again, part of this legends and myths and stereotypes is that Jews are capitalists and that they are guilty of exploiting the work, particularly of hardworking Christians. And so on the one side of your screen, you can see a much more early modern European account of Jews as moneylenders, and they have a ledger and they're keeping an accounting of who owes what. And then we have on in the colored picture, you'll see from a Nazi child propaganda book. And this is a warning to children, trying to educate them about some of the nefarious actions, supposedly, particularly of Jewish men. And so there's actually a lot going on in this particular image. We can see that by now in Nazi anti-Semitic propaganda, Jewish men are almost always portrayed in this exact type of figure where they're typically overweight. They have exaggerated noses, very large lips. And in this case, we can see that he's got a necklace, he's got a ring on his finger, and that he's trying to seduce this Aryan maiden. And the children are kind of looking on to see what's going on here. This not only talks about the economic exploitation, but it also shows us another stereotype about particularly Jewish men, and that is that they are sexual predators. And that in particular, they are looking to, in the Nazi mind and in anti-Semites' mind, to defile Gentile women. And so that they will use their financial superiority in their minds in order to get women to succumb to their advances. I'm just going to try to move us forward so we can get into some more modern types of anti-Semitism. What we're going to find is that throughout even medieval times and then moving forward into more modern times, Jews are typically depicted in very dehumanized forms. And so in the images on the screen here, what you're seeing are Nazi propaganda pieces that are depicting Jews as parasites who are out to devour the entire world. Now, even though this is considered probably more modern in its type of anti-Semitism, it still links back to the opening slide of Jews as Christ killers. And if you recall, it was because I talked about the fact that in many people's minds that Jews must be in league with the devil. And the devil wants to control the earth, wants to control the world. And so this again reaches back into and overlaps with many of these earlier stereotypes, although they're not predominantly attacking Jews for their religious beliefs or their refusal to convert to Christianity, they are still linking back into those earlier established stereotypes. By the time we get to the 1800s, we're going to end up with, thanks to the scientific work of Charles Darwin, we're going to get a new type of what I just call an ism, an ideology, and that would be social Darwinism. And this is when we move more firmly into what's typically called racial anti-Semitism. And racial anti-Semitism is based on the idea that your ethnicity and your blood gives you certain shared characteristics from people from that same racial group. And this makes really being labeled as a Jew an almost inescapable category, because the idea is that if your blood carries your outstanding qualities, your characteristics, and your traits, well, you can't get rid of your blood. And therefore, you are now trapped in that category. And the image on the screen that I have here is an attempt to show from Nazi propaganda that in their mind, Jews are the result of what they would classify as inferior and less valuable races of people, and that Jews represent what they call a bastardization of all of these inferiors, thus putting Jews at almost the very lowest rung of the racially anti-Semitic categories. Okay. Sorry about that. Another typical stereotype as we move into more modern types of anti-Semitism, but still has connections back to earlier time periods, is the image of the Jew as both warmonger, a person who wants war to break out, who wants chaos, and then linking that to the more modern ideology of communism. And so this becomes a very popular phrase, so popular in Nazi Germany that the more typical way of talking about Jews and communism is to call it Judeo Bolshevism. And of course, Bolshevism refers to the political party that Lenin led during the Second Russian Revolution. In these images, what we still find is that the idea that Jews are looking to create unrest. And this links back to much earlier stereotypes and forged documents, more specifically the forged document called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And this was a document that was forged by the Russian secret police as a way of justifying government-sanctioned and government-sponsored pogroms against Jews in Russia. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion purported to be the minutes of a secret meeting where Jewish men met together in a cemetery and they plotted how to disrupt and create chaos throughout the world. And then they plotted at that point in time when total chaos ruled that they would emerge from this chaos and, of course, take over the world, which again links us back to that opening idea of Jews linked to the devil. What we also find is that since the time of particularly the French Revolution and the rise of classical liberalism, Jews are labeled as being socially left-wing and politically left-wing, in that they gravitate towards left-wing ideologies because as persecuted people, they typically would benefit from some of the liberalization policies of a liberal regime. Of course, we could get into in the question and answer more deeply about the roots of communism and its connection with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to kind of leave this out here. Again, you can see images of Nazi propaganda pointing to that caricature of the Jewish man now wearing that Jew badge that was taken from the medieval world. And it is the Star of David labeling him as a Jew. And the poster says he is guilty of the war, right? So again, Jews are the disruptor. And then in the smaller image, if you can make it out, it's a struggle for Germany and Hitler, and his followers are very orderly. marching forward, and then beneath it is Lenin and the red flag of communism and disorder, violence, and chaos. And so these are kind of very stereotypical ways of portraying and linking Jews with warfare, with civil war, and with more liberal ideologies. Ultimately, when we look at the different stereotypes, and as I said, if you had the luxury of more time, you could go through and really dive in more deeply to each one of these major stereotypes, where they developed, how they took on a life of their own. But what I would argue is that this type of language about Jews from the earliest time periods forward promotes these prejudices, these stereotypes, so that when a person such as Adolf Hitler in the 20s and the early 30s gives a particular speech blaming Jews in a variety of ways for the problems that German people see going on around their lives, he is going to use many of these tropes because he knows that for most people, they have heard at least some of these stories about Jews. That kind of familiarity sets people's minds at ease. Ah, yes, I have heard that about Jews, therefore it must be true. And of course, our speakers are going to continue on, but the last slide I'll show you is that these Jewish stereotypes, unfortunately, are still a part of our history. You can see on the image, there are Jewish headstones that have been graffitied with the swastika. On the opposite end, you can see a synagogue where people have written terrible words on the outside to desecrate this area. And in the center, there's an image directly taken from Nazi propaganda. If you recall the earlier slide that I showed you about the dehumanization of Jews, they have now, modern or so-called modern neo-Nazis have added the image of the billionaire Jewish man, George Soros. And he is the head of this greedy, grasping creature that is out to control the entire world. So I apologize for kind of going through a large span of history and many different stereotypes, but I wanted to pack in as much as I can, and that way we can open it up for questions during the Q&A. And I think now I'll hand the program back to Dr. Carey so that he can introduce the next speaker.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we'll have some interesting questions to follow up then toward the end of our program today. But now let me turn to our next speaker, which is Dr. Bradley Hart from California State University at Fresno, where he's associate professor, author of a number of books, including really the one that he's going to be telling us about today, Hitler's American Friends, the Third Reich Supporters in the United States is the title of that book and the topic of his presentation. Previous biography of a Nazi sympathizing British anthropologist named George Pitt Rivers in 2015 that was published, and a textbook examining the 1920s at a global level entitled The Global 1920s, Politics, Economics, and Society, published by Routledge in 2016. We have probably heard that certain prominent Americans like Henry Ford and Lindbergh had Nazi sympathizers, but it turns out there was a lot deeper involvement of many Americans than that, and Dr. Hart is going to tell us about that now.
Well, thank you very much again, Dr. Carey, for the kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. What I'm going to be talking about today is a bit of American history that I think has really been left out of many of the history books. And that's actually the reason I wrote my book, was that when I was teaching my 20th century history courses, I didn't find any of the groups that I'm going to talk about in this presentation today in them at all. The only name I found, actually, Dr. Carey has already brought up, which is Charles Lindbergh, who we'll be talking about right at the end. But really, this is a part of American history that we often overlook. I think many of us, I think most of us, if not all of us, are familiar with the very dark history of prejudice in the United States. And to some extent, we're all somewhat familiar with the history of anti-Semitism in the United States. But I think the part of prejudice that we often overlook is organized anti-Semitism in the United States. We often associate anti-Semitism with casual anti-Semitism, with the inability of Jews to join country clubs, certain organizations, being unwelcome in certain professions for many, many decades. But in the 1930s and 40s, there was actually a much more organized form of anti-Semitism that directly modeled itself on the changes that were taking place in Europe. And this very provocative image illustrates some of that. This is a group called the German American Boon that we'll be hearing about quite a bit today, marching down a street in New York City. This looks like a parade that could have perhaps taken place in Munich or Berlin in the 1930s, but this is in fact New York. And you see this very troubling dichotomy here of the flags that these men are holding, of the American flag, the Stars and Stripes, next to a swastika flag in the middle that's actually the flag of the Bund itself, carried next to the national flag of Germany. And then, of course, we also see the uniforms these men are wearing. So this is a group that has, of course, directly modeled itself on the Nazi Party. And we'll talk more about what that means in a moment. And actually, this is a very good segue from the previous presentation. But one thing that we often also forget is that these groups tapped into a really deep and arguably insidious well of anti-Semitism that went far beyond casual anti-Semitism in this period. And to sort of demonstrate that point, I've pulled some public opinion data, which, admittedly was fairly rudimentary in the 1930s. The 1936 election was the first time there was really reliable public opinion data. But in the late 30s, there was this increasing interest in polling. So in August of 1938, for instance, 32% of Americans tell Fortune magazine that there is what they call growing hostility to Jews in the United States. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that these Americans approve of this growing hostility, but that they are observing it. And then I find it very interesting that in March of 39, not even a year later, a full 45% of Americans polled believe that there is growing hostility to Jews. So very demonstrably, something is happening in late 1930s America that is worth examining. And then more disturbingly of all, in summer of 1940, that should say 32% of Americans, not 35, 32% of Americans, the same number as above, say the government should, quote, prevent Jews from getting too much power in the business world. So the same number that believe there's growing hostility to Jews express growing hostility to Jews, we might say, around the same time that this poll is taken. And then most disturbingly of all, 10% say that Jews should be deported from the United States outright, quote, to some homeland as fast as can be done without inhumanity. So while 10% doesn't seem like a particularly large number, this is, of course, represents about 14 million Americans in this period. And if you dig a little bit further into public opinion data from this era, as late as 1941, there's 2% of Americans, this is after the US enters the war, 2% of Americans who say that they hope the Axis powers win the war. So again, 2% seems like a small number since we're talking about between 2 and 3 million Americans. So there's a deep well of anti-Semitic sentiment that these groups can draw upon in this period. And there's also, I argue, this sort of fascination with the Axis powers that's going to drive a lot of these groups and movements that I'm going to talk about today. So the first one that I'm going to be talking about is the one that I've mentioned already. This is, of course, the German American Bund, a group that for most Americans, I think, they've never heard of it. It's not books, at least until now. It's a group that I think for decades, even historians and experts on the era somewhat dismissed as a fringe movement that never really accomplished any of its goals. But as I argue in my book, and as I'll argue this afternoon, I think this was actually a deeply influential group that reflected many of the anti-Semitic sentiments that I showed you on the previous public opinion slide. So the Bund was created in 1936. It was founded by this man, whose name is Fritz Julius Kuhn. Fritz Kuhn, by background, is very representative of sort of the third wave of German immigrants who were arriving in the United States in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Kuhn himself claims to have been an old fighter of the Nazi Party prior to immigrating to the United States, and claims, in fact, that he had been standing near Hitler during the 1923 beer hall putsch in Munich. Historians don't know whether any of these claims are true. We believe that, or most historians believe that Kuhn made up much of his own biography. You also see pinned on his chest there on the left an iron cross that he wore sort of on the, while giving political speeches and things like that. We don't really know whether Kuhn earned his Iron Cross or simply bought it sort of secondhand as a way to burnish his military credentials. But claims to have this very representative background of an early Nazi Party member. Serves in World War I, he claims, wins the Iron Cross for heroism, becomes a early Nazi, knows Hitler in 1923. That part we don't really know. What we do know is that Kuhn does move to the West in mid-1920s. He initially migrates to Mexico, where he obtains a job as a chemist. Somewhat surprisingly, unlike many early members of the Nazi Party, Kuhn actually has a university degree. So he has this sort of educated background, becomes a chemist in Mexico, then manages to immigrate to the United States, where he takes a job working, perhaps unsurprisingly, for the Ford Motor Company. But a bit surprisingly, actually loses his job because of his politics. Even though he and Henry Ford might have had much in common politically, they probably never knew it, or Ford never knew it about Kuhn, because he was fired. Kuhn was fired from Ford for practicing his political speeches in a closet at the Ford plant while on the clock. So Kuhn has this job, that fairly good job in Detroit, well-educated person. In 1936, Kuhn founds the German-American Bund, ostensibly as a way to link German Americans to their heritage in what is now the Third Reich. Now, we have to remember, there are literally millions of German immigrants to the United States in this period, most of whom had actually arrived in the 1890s. And many of those German Americans had very much abandoned their German identity during the First World War. There were literally hundreds of German language newspapers in the US prior to 1917, and far fewer after 1918. And in fact, there was, in one instance, a lynching of a German American by a mob during the First World War. So anti-German sentiment had certainly taken a toll on the German American community's links with Germany. But Kuhn is really targeting this new generation of people that are more like him. So demographic studies have revealed that most of the Bund's membership was actually recent immigrants, people who had migrated in the 1920s, who did feel perhaps an affinity still for Germany, had not experienced the great wave of anti-German sentiment after World War I and during World War I, and many of whom were themselves political refugees, or saw themselves as political refugees. Many of Kuhn's early associates in the Bund, we do know, were members of the early Nazi Party, and many of them actually go back to fight for Germany during the Second World War. So Kuhn really creates this organization both as a sort of social organization and a heritage organization, but also with these staunch political undertones. You can see on the left, his main symbol is this rising swastika, very much derived from the Nazi Party. He introduces those uniforms you see there, including his own, very much modeled on those being used by the SA and later on the SS. And Kuhn's own speaking style is very much based upon Hitler's. So he tries to deliver these sort of stem-winding, emotive speeches, which works fairly well for him when he's speaking German, but he often tries to give speeches in English. And so he develops among the English-speaking community a reputation for being an almost humorous figure, because he's speaking with this thick German accent, which many non-German speakers find more entertaining than threatening, apparently. So Kuhn is this sort of figure that in many parts of the country was actually a household name in the 1930s. The Bund actually goes off in 1936 to meet with Hitler during the Olympic Games. So that's Hitler, of course, on the left. That is Kuhn in the center there with some of his lieutenants from the Midwestern Bund organization, meeting with Hitler himself. This is actually a very shrewd move. The 36 Olympic Games are a great propaganda coup for the Reich. And during these games, they've invited a tremendous number of foreigners, foreign VIPs, to attend the games. And Kuhn sort of takes advantage of this, though he is not himself invited. He takes it on himself to invite himself and seeks an audience with Hitler during this time, knowing that Hitler will not turn down any foreign delegations. So all that he gets from this meeting, incidentally, Kuhn, is this snapshot, which he runs on the front page of his propaganda newspaper for Bund members. But Hitler himself sort of meets briefly with this group, apparently accepts a charitable contribution from them. They actually come with some money they've raised for the Winter Help campaign, which was the Nazis' charitable sort of organization or yearly effort they did to try to help later on soldiers. But Kuhn comes with a contribution. Of course, Hitler thanks him for it, and he gets Kuhn gets this propaganda photo. So now, after 1936, after the middle of 36, Kuhn declares himself to be the Führer of the United States. Claims that Hitler has actually given him personal permission to build a version of the Nazi Party in the US. So this is the photo that allows him to do that. Kuhn rapidly begins to build up a nationwide organization. So this propaganda is fairly effective. And I would argue, coupled with that deep sort of undertone of anti-Semitism that exists in the US in this period. We should mention the Bund is openly anti-Semitic. their slogan that they will repeat over and over is "Free America," by which, of course, they mean, as we can infer from the last presentation, an America free from supposed Jewish domination. And this will be a theme that runs across Kuhn's speeches. And I'll give you an example of that in a moment. But Boon membership sort of skyrockets between 1936 and 1939. Kuhn himself claims to have about 100,000 members at the peak of his power. Historians have argued that number may be much lower, more closer to 20,000. I actually tend towards the higher number, probably not as high as 200,000. But knowing the membership numbers is difficult because later on, the Boon will destroy most of its membership records. The FBI will seize many of them. And there's also a certain amount of flux built into the membership numbers to begin with, because there is a membership fee for actually becoming a full member of the Boon. And so people drop out at various points and come back or drop to sort of an associate membership status. But there's a large number of people involved in this. Boon rallies would routinely pull in tens of thousands of people. And I'll give you an example of that in a moment. There were 69 local chapters around the country. I have an image sort of illustrating where they were centered in a moment. And they were perhaps predictably strongest in the New York and Detroit areas, less or more surprisingly in the Los Angeles area. So Los Angeles surprised me doing this research, and still I have not come up with a fully satisfying explanation as to why LA was such a large Boon center. There was not a particularly large German American community there. There was a great deal of political extremism in LA in the period, and we'll see another example of that in a moment. But the Boon was seen as one of the biggest sort of public safety threats in LA in this period. They were actually known for routinely starting street brawls with various other groups. So the Los Angeles Police Department and various intelligence organizations kept a very close eye on the Boon in LA in this period. And again, I'm not entirely sure why they were so strong there. The Boon also embarked on a very interesting campaign to essentially speculate in property in this period. So as I mentioned, the Boon had a membership fee associated with joining the organization. Part of that money went into a real estate portfolio that Kuhn invested in. So all of the little swastikas you see on this map were actually summer camps that the Boon either purchased land to hold and actually develop the land, or had come to some arrangement with a local municipality or other organization to use their property. So we can see the obvious headquarters that we talked about a moment ago. New York City has several large camps, including the largest, which is a place called Camp Siegfried in the Long Island area. And there's actually some interesting research going on into Camp Siegfried now, because it was actually the sort of gold standard camp, if you will, for the Boon. They would actually entertain Nazi diplomats and other dignitaries from the Third Reich at this camp, which they eventually developed into a full-scale community, which actually persists to this day. The homes that they built for their activities are actually still around in the remains of this community. So an interesting afterlife there. We see a few in sort of Pennsylvania. We see a couple in sort of the Virginia, Washington, D.C. area. Of course, Detroit, very large German American community there, makes sense. And then you see very few in the Midwest, which is surprising given the large German American population there. And then you see a surprising number in the far west. So 3 of them around the San Francisco area. There was one actually in Petaluma and one in the East Bay of San Francisco. There's one in the sort of Portland area, and there's one actually in sort of western or eastern Washington, I should say, near the Idaho border. And then, of course, there's one in the Los Angeles area as well. So this is the Boon's not only centers of their support that can support an actual physical facility for their activities, but this is where they've actually invested in their real estate as well. Now, these summer camps would actually become one of the more troubling facets of the Boon's activities, because these camps were actually used primarily for children. So from 1936 to 1940, the Boon encouraged its members to send their children to Boon to summer camp, which ostensibly had many of the appearances of a sort of standard summer camp that we might be familiar with today. There was outdoorsmanship, there was archery, there was shooting lessons with small caliber weapons, all things that children might do and reasonably do in summer camps today. But of course, there was an ideological aspect as well. As we can see from this image, we see two boys giving the Nazi salute. We see one hoisting a sort of sign bearing a symbol that looks remarkably like that of the SS. And then we see someone raising what appears to be the Nazi flag on the right. This is the true content of these camps, as will be exposed later on. There is marching, there is the learning of Nazi propaganda songs, the teaching of German, and certainly much Heiling Hitler and associated activities. So these camps are much more than a standard summer camp. These are essentially ideological indoctrination. And much like the Nazi Party itself, Boon says over and over again that it is the youth who will carry the banner of Nazism into the future. And so they put a premium on reaching children as young as they possibly can and indoctrinating them, as they ostensibly say, to fight for the principles of Nazism. We do not know how many of these children end up traveling to Nazi Germany to fight on behalf of the Reich later on. There is some anecdotal evidence that at least some of them do. And that probably was the intention of these camps to some extent. We see here another troubling example. This is actually a Boon Christmas pageant that was held in Los Angeles that was infiltrated by a group called the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League, which kept tabs on these extremist organizations. But these are children as young as 8 or 9, apparently performing a fairly standard Christmas pageant, followed by a song praising Hitler and give copious numbers of the Nazi salute. So we have here this organization that clearly is oriented towards indoctrination. This sort of campaign culminates in February of 1939 with a rally at Madison Square Garden. Kuhn decides on a sort of strategy of mass attack against the United States, or a mass provocation, I should say, of American public opinion, and holds a rally in which he sells 22,000 tickets in Madison Square Garden for what is a all-out Nazi rally. We see the banners there, Stop Jewish Domination of Christian America. We see the Free America as a slogan. And this event becomes a catastrophe, essentially, for the city of New York. There is a riot in the arena between anti-Nazi protesters. The Bund itself tries to insert armed thugs to attack the counter-protesters, and this becomes essentially a riot where the New York City Police Department is caught essentially in the middle of this catastrophe. Kuhn, sort of loving this moment of mass provocation, decides to capitalize on this by delivering a stemwinder in which he declares that if George Washington were alive today, and he includes Abraham Lincoln in this as well, then he would certainly be a Nazi. So this is a moment where Kuhn has sort of laid his cards on the table in a national setting. And at this critical moment, a Jewish American man named Isidore Greenbaum, who has attended this rally mostly to heckle the Boon members — there were a certain number of very courageous individuals that did this — later said that he could take this provocation no longer. And so Isidore Greenbaum rushes the stage as Kuhn is delivering this deeply anti-Semitic address, where he is promptly tackled by Kuhn's bodyguards, beaten severely on stage, and actually dragged off by Kuhn's armed guards. And so this is essentially Kuhn's moment of greatest triumph in many ways. He has now gotten the attention of the entire country. This has become front page news. The Nazi press actually picks up the Greenbaum incident as a supposed assassination attempt by an international Jewish conspiracy against Kuhn. And this is essentially the moment that Kuhn has been seeking. And so now we have.
Let me just say, Brad, we're getting short on time.
Yep, absolutely. I'll wrap up. So Greenbaum has sort of very provocatively put this moment forward in the public eye. This will actually be Kuhn's downfall as well. In November of 1939, following an investigation of the Boon's finances, Kuhn actually is arrested by federal marshals. He is charged with embezzlement and fraud, because as it turns out, some of the money from the Boon's coffers has been going into Kuhn's own pocket. And Kuhn then essentially will spend the rest of the war in prison. Rather than leading the United States as he had hoped during the Second World War as a Führer, he now spends the rest of the war in Sing Sing prison. Knowing time is short, I will focus only on one more example. While the Boon was a nationwide organization that tapped, I think, into the deep anti-Semitism of the period, William Dudley Pelley presents an equally troubling example of just how insidious this anti-Semitism could become. By background, Pelley was a Hollywood screenwriter turned mystic, actually, in the 1930s, who founds an organization called the Silver Legion, which is largely based out of the Seattle-Tacoma region. The Silver Legion was much smaller than the Boon, a maximum of 15,000 members. They trained their members in weapons and hand-to-hand combat. and essentially trained them ostensibly for a fascist takeover of the United States. We know from the surviving foreign ministry records that Pelle, in fact, sought the support of the German foreign ministry with an eye towards potentially becoming a Gauleiter in the United States if the Nazis invaded. Pelle himself ends up, much like Kuhn, in deep legal trouble because he himself embezzled money from his own organization. But this was not a man who had only a small following. He ran for president in 1936 on the ballot in the state of Washington. And while the Legion was eventually shut down by 1941, this was an organization that commanded a great deal of press attention and certainly was seen as a major threat to the national security of the United States. So to conclude, while neither of these organizations were huge numerically, they represent a deep and stark reminder of the depths of organized anti-Semitism in the United States in this period. All of the tropes that we heard in the first presentation were used to great effect by these organizations to build a major following. And it's really only through the concerted efforts of the FBI and actually members of Congress investigating these groups that Hitler's American friends were largely rendered incapacitated before they could do any damage. During the war, almost all of these organizations were shut down. Most of their leaders were already in prison at that point. But they should still serve as a stark reminder of just how tempting this type of ideology can be, even in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you. I think with this concept of organized versus casual anti-Semitism, you've given us something to think about, particularly with respect to current events. Okay, now we are going to turn to our third panelist. Let me say that I would invite you, I'm not going to close the panel right at the 75-minute mark. We have some extra time. We don't have another presentation until 7 o'clock this evening, so if you're willing to stay with us, we can continue to talk. And so now I'm introducing Dr. Suzanne Brown-Fleming, who's with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, where she directs their international academic programs. She is also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University Center for Jewish Civilization in Washington, D.C. The title of our presentation is Forgive Us Our Sins, Vatican Perceptions of Holocaust War Crimes Post-War, which draws upon information just recently made available when Pope Francis opened up the Vatican archives for the period of Pope Pius XII's papacy, which was 1939 to 1958, so much of the Nazi period. Dr. Brown-Fleming is the author of The Holocaust and Catholic Conscience, Cardinal Aloysius Munch, and The Guilt Question in Germany, published in 2006. Among other books, she's appeared on CNN, EWTN Global Catholic Television Network, and a number of documentaries. Google her name online and you might be able to watch some of those. In 2017, her book was May Your Holiness Act in the Interest of Protecting Those Who Remain Morally Thinking People, Vatican Response to Anti-Semitism, 1933, which draws upon the Vatican Nunciature records from Munich and Berlin during the time of Pope Pius XI, 1933. And in 2016, she published Nazi Persecution and Post-War Repercussions, the International Tracing Service Archive in Holocaust Research, which showcases the great research potential of the 150 million Holocaust-related documents in the ITS. And one more, her 2006 book is The Holocaust and Catholic Conscience, Cardinal Aloysius Munch and the Guilt Question. I think I mentioned that already. And a number of other participation in documentaries and so on. So let me turn to Dr. Suzanne Brown-Fleming.
Is my sound good? Can everybody hear me well?
Your sound is good.
Awesome, awesome. Well, hello everyone. I'm really delighted to be part of this wonderful, esteemed panel today. And I'm delighted to present some findings from the recently opened archives of the Pontificate of Pope Pius XII. As was mentioned, they were released by Pope Francis in March 2020 and painstakingly prepared by His Holiness's team of prefects and archivists. The new documents, as was mentioned, cover the duration of that papacy, 1939 to 1958. And this presentation, which I've called Forgive Us Our Sins, Vatican Perceptions of Holocaust War Crimes Post-War, are mine alone. They do not necessarily represent those of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum or any other organization. I'm going to speak actually for a fairly short period, only going to give you one or two vignettes so that we have a lot of time for discussion. I hope that that is okay. So if I'm unclear, we can save it for the Q&A. I want to take us back to the first weeks of December 1948, and you're going to hear in some of the things that I'm saying a lot of resonance with Beth's wonderful presentation, and also with the one we just heard on Nazism in the United States. During the first weeks of December 1948, papal emissary Aloysius Munch met with the Vatican nuncio or papal diplomat to the United States, Amleto Cicognani, in Washington, D.C., to discuss Germans indicted and convicted for war crimes by Allied courts in occupied Germany and now incarcerated in Landsberg and Spandau prisons in Germany. Monsignor Giovanni Battista Montini, at the time Undersecretary of State and one of Pope Pius XII's closest confidants, had requested that Cicognani approach Washington officials on behalf of convicted German war criminals sentenced to imprisonment or death. Cicognani, in turn, requested a meeting with Munch, who was visiting the United States on furlough from his post as a relief officer for the Vatican mission in Kronberg, Germany. Munch was also the liaison representative between American occupation officials and the German Catholic Church. After a discussion with Cicognani on December 6th of 1948, Munch wrote a memorandum on the Landsberg prison cases for the nuncio, dated December 7th. On December 14th, Cicognani submitted the following petition to all occupation authorities, Allied and Soviet, and I quote here: "The Holy See presents a plea for mercy on behalf of German nationals condemned to death as war criminals by the military tribunals in Germany. Without any violation of justice, it is hoped that occupation authorities will commute the existing death sentences into other penalties, at least in those cases where there's even a slight doubt of guilt or where mitigating circumstances may be found." End of quote. A few months later, in the early fall of 1949, Pope Pius XII instructed Munch to write a letter supporting clemency for convicted German war criminals to General Thomas Handy of the United States European Command, or EUCOM. Munch was now papal regent since October of 1949 and could speak openly as a representative of Pius XII. And I quote the letter here, and it's interesting thinking back to Beth's presentation to look at the language here. Quote, "In the spirit of centuries-old traditions, the Church seeks to have justice tempered with mercy. In accord with time-honored prerogative of the Church to intercede for even the worst of criminals, Pope Pius XII respectfully requests clemency be shown." End of quote. This is the letter Munch wrote to General Handy on February 27, 1950. Now, efforts for convicted German war criminals involved the aforementioned Cardinal Munch and also Monsignor Giovanni Battista Montini, future Saint Pope Paul VI from 1963 to 78, as well as Domenico Tardini, future Secretary of State under Pope John XXIII. Pacelli, or Pope Pius XII, Montini, and Tardini equaled the most well-informed and powerful ruling body within the Vatican since the death of Pope Pius XI in 1939. And sometimes very publicly, This triumvirate intervened for Germans convicted of war crimes, including but not limited to Holocaust atrocities, at the International Military Tribunal and Nuremberg trials, and in the so-called Dachau trials conducted by the U.S. Army in the immediate post-war years. Now, with the new archives, and I've now had 3 sessions, October 2020, June 2020, June 2021, October 2021, and I'll be returning again in January. With these new archives, the discussions and motivations of Pope Pius XII and his helpers, Tardini, Montini, and Munch, can be fully researched. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, or so-called Pope's Archive, and used to be called the Secret Archive, contains correspondence about several high-visibility cases, including that of Oswald Pohl. Pohl joined the Nazi Party in 1926 and the SS in 1929. He became Chief of Administration at the SS headquarters in February 1934, responsible for the SS units and the concentration camps. Ultimately, he headed the organization responsible for the sprawling concentration camp universe, recruiting millions of inmates for forced labor units, and responsible for selling Jewish possessions. On November 3rd, 1947, in the U.S. versus Oswald Pohl et al., the U.S. Army sentenced Pohl to death. During the 3-year confinement in Landsberg prison that followed the trial, Pohl converted to Catholicism. Finding God and the Church did not prevent Pohl's execution by hanging on June 8, 1951. Munch exchanged multiple letters on the Pohl case with Montini after Munch learned via the Christian News Service in Munich that the Holy Father had indeed issued a papal blessing to Pohl prior to the election. The apostolic blessing or pardon at the hour of death is part of the last rites in the Catholic tradition. In Munch's view, and I quote, "This was not at all a matter of a telegram from the Vatican, much less a position taken by the Pope on the Pohl case," end quote. But was this really a simple case of the Vicar of Christ on earth providing a sacrament to one of his faithful, no matter what the sin? Several letters from Tardini and Montini to Munch, discovered in the Vatican Apostolic Archive, suggest other motives may also have been at play. In early January 1949, in the months before Pacelli's note to General Handy via Munch requesting clemency, certain stories had reached the Secretariat's ears. On January 20th, in a memorandum marked sensitive, Tardini wrote to Kronberg, Germany, Chargé d'Affaires Opilio Rossi, and I quote, "It has been brought to the attention of this office, that of the Pope, that numerous Israelites, who for the most part returned to Germany with the Allied troops, and who sometimes occupy important positions in the governments of occupation themselves, are engaged in activities that are often not without prejudice to Catholic interests. It is also stated that in these regions, a not inconsiderable resurgence of anti-Semitism is occurring. I would be most grateful to the pontifical representation in Germany if it would inform me about this matter and indicate the names of those who occupy important posts," end of quote, Tardini wrote. And again, we have to remember this is one of 3 of the most powerful men in the Catholic Church. Before discussing the reply to Tardini from the Kronberg mission, let us pause to mark this was only one of regular discussions between Pacelli, Pope Pius XII, Tardini, and Montini on this issue that I came across, and I can say more in the Q&A. Now, it was actually Munch and not Rossi who responded to the Secretariat of State in a multi-page report so replete with intensive anti-Jewish tropes that it is difficult to read. Among other accusations, Munch alleged it was, quote, "well known that the majority of the personnel in the post-war trials of criminals, especially at Nuremberg, are persons of Jewish origin. Many came to make a hard peace for Germany and did not come in a spirit of conciliation, but in a spirit of vindictiveness. end quote. Now, Munch could not provide the specific Jewish names that Tardini had requested and answered instead with unspecified allegations of Jewish control of the American Counterintelligence Corps, the Property Control Division, and the Information Control Division. There is no response from Tardini to Munch in the folder, unfortunately, and perhaps I will discover it with time on my next research trip. At least one of Tardini's sources about allegedly powerful Jews in the American military government was American attorney Warren McGee, defense attorney to Ernst von Weizsäcker, former German ambassador to the Vatican. After the end of the war, Weizsäcker initially remained in Vatican City with his wife as a guest of Pope Pius XII and a member of the diplomatic corps. He did not return to Germany until 1946. Weizsäcker was arrested on July 25, 1947, and tried as part of the so-called Ministries Trial, also known as the Wilhelmstrasse Trial, after the location of the German Foreign Office in Berlin. Weizsäcker was charged with active cooperation with the deportation of French Jews to Auschwitz, among other charges related to the Holocaust. In 1949, Weizsäcker was found guilty and sentenced to 7 years in prison. Pacelli, Montini, and Tardini were deeply engaged in efforts thereafter to commute Weizsäcker's sentence, help his family, and clear his name. Part of this effort was contact with the law offices of McGee, Beatty, and McGovern in Washington, D.C. On May 3, 1949, Weizsäcker's defense attorney McGee wrote to Pope Pius XII to explain the initial guilty verdict. Here I will quote at some length. Quote, "The opinion of the majority of the tribunal places special and unnecessary emphasis on crimes committed against the Jews. In fact, practically every crime committed against the Jews in the Third Reich is described therein. This bears out the statement which I have made to your holiness, that these trials follow a mosaic pattern, and because of the composition of the prosecution staff, have not been conducted in either a fair or objective manner. It grieves me to have to make this statement because I'm an American, and these abortive trials have been conducted in the name of my country. I'm convinced Baron von Weizsäcker is innocent and secretly fought with every means at his command for peace against Hitler and on the side of the persecuted. In doing so, he walked a double cavalry, and all the religious inferences are very interesting here, walked a double cavalry and ran the risk of being misjudged by the world and his own people. For these reasons, I beg of your holiness the great privilege of another private audience for the purpose of discussing Weizsäcker's case and to seek the advice of your holiness on the matter." End of quote. So before I open so we can talk about these three papers together, one may draw two tentative conclusions from the exchanges between Munch and the Secretariat from the documents in these folders. And I just gave you a few examples. There are many more. First, empathy, mercy, and repeatedly cited Christian charity for Germans after the Holocaust was a policy, if not a priority, for Pope Pius XII and his closest advisors. Second, suspicion, fear, and centuries-old anti-Jewish tropes about Judaism as a religion that stood for an eye did not end after 1945. Based on these documents, there is reason to think these widespread sentiments were shared by Montini, Tardini, and the Pope himself. The sea change that would come with Nostra Aetate in 1965, declaring anti-Semitism as a sin and taking it out of Catholic education and teaching, was still decades away. Yet it's too early to claim definitive conclusions. It's very important that we give the researchers all across the world right now working in these new papers the solid, I would say, 5 to 10 years that they're going to need to really each do their work and then put all of their conclusions together to really fill out this whole puzzle. I have only been able to raise some examples here, and Even so, I do believe the core story that we tell now about the Vatican, the Catholic Church, and the Holocaust, as well as the tenacious afterlife of anti-Semitism in Germany, the United States, and the Church at large, will be fundamentally altered after historians have done their work for many, many years. And I think that questions will be replaced by transparency, as the Holy Father has asked of scholars. Tens of thousands of documents in the multiple Vatican archives for the 1939 to 1958 period are still to be consulted, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Now we have some time for questions. We are going a little bit over time. But I think, Dr. Paharek, do you think we can still ask a few questions?
Yeah, Mike, if I can just jump in, I wanted to make this panel one that provided new and shattering information to our audience, and you certainly did that, even beyond our expectations. So really appreciate the presentations. Yes, I would say we have a few minutes. If people have questions, if you could put those in the chat. And Mike, if it's okay with you, I just have a quick question for Bradley, maybe to get us started. You mentioned that there was a rise in anti-Semitic feeling in the United States during the 1930s. Do you think there was some influence from what Hitler was doing in Germany, some pro-Nazi sentiment in general at that time, or how do you explain that phenomenon?
Question. I think there's no doubt that many Americans who are inclined in some way towards anti-Semitic beliefs look at what's happening in Germany favorably in the 1930s. We have to also remember the media context of this time. This is when Father Charles Coughlin, of course, has a radio audience of more than 20 million people a week, largely immigrants east of the Mississippi, so the most influential media commentator possibly in history. And I think we also have to remember that we have more and more individuals who are, I would argue, playing with the fire of anti-Semitism in this period. The biggest culmination of this I see is Charles Lindbergh, who, of course, on September 11th, 1941, gives his speech in Des Moines where he more or less blames the Jewish community for the outbreak of the war in Europe, which is something that even he had never said before. So I think we see a gradual escalation of the 1930s as more and more Americans are becoming exposed to these ideas. Those who may have received some of those messages previously, as Beth pointed out in her presentation, certainly that's the background of much of this. But I think there's no doubt that by 1941, there's a number of Americans who have already fallen into this trap. And that kind of flies in the face of a lot of earlier scholarship. There was a view for a long time that anti-Semitism emerges because of the Great Depression and anti-Semitic tropes being placed in this economic context. I don't think that's the case at all. If that were the case, then we would have seen much deeper levels of anti-Semitism in 1933 than 39.
I'll follow up on what you were just saying, Dr. Hart. It seems like the conditions that people are experiencing with 25% unemployment across the country on an average. In Westmoreland County, where we're situated, it was over 40% because of the heavy dependence upon the coal industry, which completely collapsed. And so there was really the rise of extremist movements on both the left and the right. You've shown us how there was some on the fascist side. But we didn't devolve into the kind of politics that characterized Central Europe. And I think two things that come about. One is the way that our politicians deviated quite substantially from those of Italy and Germany in particular, and also that the fact that what the Roosevelt administration strove to do was to instill a sense of hope. Even though the Depression kept lingering on and on and on, they were always creating programs that give a promise to people. And I think more than the actual rise in income was the sense that we're going to help you out. And that sense of hope kind of helped to mute the extremism. And I think that was one of Roosevelt's explicit goals in this country. So
I agree entirely. I mean, I think what you often see these extremist groups saying is that hasn't done enough, right? They very rarely say, in some cases they'll say, oh, Roosevelt's moving us towards socialism or something like that. But if you look at the policies that the Boon is advocating, it looks much more similar to Hitler's economic policies, which are arguably more in the sort of national socialist direction with government control over certain industries and things like that. So the traditional political spectrum kind of breaks down when we talk about a lot of these groups in this period. But I think that's right. And the other factor is that both political parties do a great deal of internal policing. There are some of these individuals that try to run for political office. One example being Gerald Winrod, who was a extremist preacher, Protestant preacher in Kansas, who actually runs for the U.S. Senate in 1938, nearly wins the Republican primary, only loses because the National Republican Party steps in and runs a former governor against him when it appears that Winrod is leading in the polls. Literally, he is nicknamed the Jayhawk Nazi. So it's not as if he's concealing his views. He is openly pro-Nazi in this period. So that's how close it comes. But the political parties do a great deal of work policing and forcing these people out of the political spectrum. And also, of course, they sort of run out of time. The high point for much of this is 1939. By the end of 1941, these groups are essentially forced out of the public sphere.
It's also worth remembering that until 1941, the Nazis looked like they were winning. I mean, this looked like being on the winning side. There was a lot from 1933 to 41 for those inclined to such beliefs to think that they were on the right side of history.
Beth, do you have a thought about that?
Oh, no, I agree with Suzanne. I mean, I think that, the turning point really isn't until Stalingrad, right, in 42 into 43. And so for most people, that period of victories, if you're in America and you're already inclined to those types of attitudes and supportive of Nazi policies, it does look like you're siding with what will ultimately be the winner. And again, we also know that Franklin Delano Roosevelt did not declare war on Nazi Germany, right? Hitler handed FDR the gift after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th. A few days after, around December 11th, 1941, Hitler decided to declare war on America. And I think that I'm not an American historian, but I think that there is a debate about how much American support there was to not just fight against the Japanese, but then to also engage in battle in the European theater as well. And so I think that is borne out. I think that those are good things to keep in the back of our minds when we're thinking about what is motivating so many of these groups and their level of fanaticism and support for Hitler. He's winning. And that is very attractive to many people.
And I think in terms of the Pope Pius XI and XII, there too, the Mussolini regime, the Hitler regime, were successful political powers to contend with, and until the turn of the war in 1941, in late 1941, finding some way to protect church interests in the face of these two regimes that looked like they might control Europe for decades to come is something we should remember when we're thinking about the kinds of questions we talk about in this conference.
And I would throw in that connected to that would be the fear of Bolshevism, right, or the spread of communism, right? That this is one of the key pillars of Hitler's successful formula was to, at least in the early 30s, to portray himself as the defender of Western Christian civilization against Jewish atheistic communism. And that certainly ties in with the fears of Catholic Church leaders. And I think sometimes Suzanne teases me about that. Some of my research and publications are on the Spanish Civil War, but I am going to throw this in here, right? That when the Spanish Civil War erupts in 1936 and drags on through 1939, Hitler very successfully lobbies, particularly German Catholic Church leaders, to support and collaborate with the Nazi regime, because he's fighting the spread of atheistic or Judeo Bolshevism. And so this becomes another point of appeal for people, whether they're Catholic or outside living in America, the fear of the communist man coming to take over. And so those are things that people should keep in the back of their mind.
One more thing, maybe, Dr. Brown-Fleming. Does your archival research support the idea, the notion that maybe if Pope Pius XI had not been ill and died, that he had survived until after the war, that the church history might have been very different?
You know, I get asked that a lot because of Steve Pressman's fine film on Holy Silence, and this is one of the areas where the current researchers are working in Rome, and there's a really strong group from Germany, from France, from Italy. Our colleagues and friends at Yad Vashem were just there last week. There are a few key issues that we're all really revved up about to try to untangle. That is one of them. These mysterious months in the early winter of 1939, when Pope Pius XI was very ill and had this encyclical drafted by Father John Lafarge that did not get issued because of Father Ledikowski. And then with the untimely death of Pius XI, was swept right off of Pius XII's desk. That is a question that researchers have been trying to get to. I wouldn't say we have any breakthrough new answers yet, but we do have a number of researchers from all over the world trying to really look at those key months and what happened with this encyclical that Pius XI had worked on and was hoping to put out there right before his untimely death. I do think that sometimes Pope Pius XI, Achille Ratti, gets a little more credit than he deserves. I find that David Kurtzer's work is really excellent on the subject of Pius XI and his close relationship with Mussolini and the fascist regime, that his many compromises with Mussolini in order to keep the Italian church and the Italian city-state, the Vatican city-state stabilized. Pius XI made plenty of his own deals with Mussolini, and was the Pope in charge when the Concordat with the Nazis was signed in 1933. Had this change of heart towards the end of his life, but I think if we look at the whole trajectory of his papacy, we should remember those things too.
I thank you.
Sorry, Mike, go ahead.
I noticed a question from the audience here. Maybe we could finish up on that. It looks like It probably wouldn't be too lengthy in terms to answer it. This is directed at Dr. Hart, and it says, after the dissolution of the pro-Nazi organizations that you discuss, did members of those groups then create any new organizations or extremist groups in the time after that?
Great question, and something I get asked quite a lot. So most of the leaders of the groups I talked about were actually in prison or dead by the end of the Second World War. A number of the leaders of the Bund after Fritz Kuhn either committed suicide or went off to fight on the Eastern Front and never returned. So the Bund's leadership was pretty much gone by the late 40s. And I actually did try to trace as many members as I could who I had the names of, and most of them are untraceable post-war. So they either went back to Germany, some of them were probably deported, but certainly this was an organization that had tens, if not hundreds of thousands of members, so there must have been Boon members around for many decades, and possibly even some of the children who were in those camps. One example of a person that did take part in these groups, became prominent later, was Gerald Lk Smith, who is a name that actually has some recent resonance. He was a activist up through the 1980s, I want to say. He was actually part of the Huey Long machine in Louisiana, ends up becoming an anti-Semitic sort of rabble-rouser, in the 1940s, and then goes off after the war and founds a number of isolationist groups, becomes involved in isolationist politics, and eventually tries to take a role in the Goldwater campaign in '64, which the campaign does not let him accept. But Lk Smith has a lengthy career, and I argue is one of Hitler's last American friends. I mean, this is a man who was openly pro-Nazi in the 1930s, still apparently enjoys some political clout as late as the 1960s, and dies even after that. So there is a continuity, and this is an area that I'm working on now, is trying to trace some of these lesser members and see what became of them in the post-war period.
Very good.
It's really,
and I would,
really, yeah.
That Smith was an avowed anti-Semite, but there's
Yes.
Huey Long really wasn't an anti-Semite based on what he published or said.
Yeah, Long apparently adopted
Thank you very much
anti-Semitism
for
after the
full
Long
discussion.
period.
You know, let me just close by saying I love the way our conversation wove together all three presentations. And while they seem to be maybe on slightly different topics, you can see how they all augmented one another. And I think all three presentations are a profound testimony to the importance of continuing to research the Holocaust. You've all discovered some really groundbreaking information about that era, and it's information that we all need to be aware of and to consider as we think about this difficult period in our history. So thank you all very much. Dr. Carey, thank you for moderating our session today. Thank you all for being with us and for hanging in with us a little bit over time. Yes, and we'll see you all at 7 p.m. this evening, I hope.